Okay, in terms of the stuff, as always, it's just bad news. Someday good news, not today. Deadlines, same as they've been all along. Quizzes part 1, deadline 5, May 19th. Exam 1, quizzes part 2, deadline 5, May 29th. Exam 2, quizzes part 3, deadline June 9th. Exam 3, June 17th. Exam 4, quizzes part 4, exam 5, June 18th. And this is all end of term, so they're available until then. They become de-available. You can do everything ahead of time, but just be sure to complete it before the deadline. For the paper, there's several dates. If you want to do a draft, the deadline is June 10th. Again, drafts are not required, but if you want to do one, you can do as many as you want until either you get the grades you want, or you just say no more drafts and decide to stop it, or time runs out. The +5 deadline is June 11th. That's, you get your base score, +5, that's the extra credity stuff. Full credit is June 15th, half credit June 18th. And then I'll have the grades anti-rattler on June 19th. So be sure if you have any grade issues or grade problems, be sure to check your grades like here, and then contact me before then so something can be done, if anything can be done. Before pressing on to the new stuff, namely looking at our good dead friend Socrates, talking about the paper, anything about the stuff that has been, or the stuff that shall be, that needs more stuff?
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, you know the sample paper that you gave us, can we use that as, well, can we use that as a guide? Like, can we okay, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the reason why it's there is to give you an example of, what sort of thing to do. I mean, you wouldn't want to, just copy it, but people often ask, like, well, how long should it be? What should arguments look like? How should it be developed? And it's basically there to serve as an example. So if you're wondering, like, what should my paper kind of look like, that provides a good example. But anything else? Okay, so last time we're looking at our good dead friend Socrates, and looking at some background for him. We saw he was born in 470 BC, and died in 309 BC, and is of course still dead today. And then we started looking at the famous Socratic method, looking at the method of questioning. And the basic idea is pretty straightforward. Socrates runs into somebody, and they start talking about some philosophy stuff. Then a key concept like justice or mercy or love comes into play, and Socrates says he doesn't know what is meant by this, and he's somewhat confused by it. So he asks for clarification. The person gives a better definition, repeats it. Socrates says, very good, but I need more clarification. And he keeps going until the person reaches the point where they say, oh gosh, look at the time, Socrates, gotta go. Or they say, gosh, Socrates, you're so cool, can I hang out with you and talk some philosophy stuff? Now the second part of the Socratic method is argumentation. And this is sort of, as I mentioned before, argumentation is kind of the brain of philosophy or the nervous system. The idea is basically to try to prove stuff. Now Socrates was often fairly critical in his approach in terms of addressing definitions. And one thing he typically did was take a definition and find flaws in it. And he's not doing this just to be a jerk. He's doing it because his goal presumably is to find true stuff. Now this stuff still applies today, even though Socrates was Socratizing long ago and he's really dead. We still deal with definitions even today. And we have to go through, if we're trying to make a good definition, to see if it's, bless you, actually stands up to criticism. Now from a practical standpoint, where might you deal with definitions, say in profession? Well, to give two obvious and important examples, it would be the matter of law, defining terms legally. And if you look at any legal documentation, there generally include a lot of definitions. Closely related to that, of course, is in business. Everyone probably has used iTunes or similar thing, and you probably just kind of zip through the end user license agreement, but there's all kinds of definitions in there. So if you're considering a career in business or law or anything involving words, good definitions are important. And lawyers get paid some pretty good money to work out those definitions. So how can you look at definitions in terms of flaws? Well, one way to do it is to look at structural flaws in a definition. One problem is, as Socrates notes, is that a definition could be circular. And a circular definition is bad because what it does is it, as the name implies, it takes us in a circle. So, for example, if someone endeavored to define what it is to be virtuous and said that, you know, virtue is what a virtuous person has, that's true. Just like a tall person is tall, but it doesn't really tell us what virtue is. Similarly, defining like tall person as a person who is tall doesn't help us. True, but circular. Another common mistake is that Socrates criticized is when a definition takes the part of something to be the whole of the thing. Basically, to define, you know, the whole area based on a small part of it. So if someone is trying to define morality, and they said, well, morality is justice. I mean, true, justice is part of morality, but that's only part of it. You can't define the whole by a part. A third problem, which is, not really ironically, but interestingly and boringly enough, is actually a way to define stuff. One type of legitimate definition is called definition by example, and included in there is what's often called the ostensive definition or definition by pointing. We point at stuff, give examples. Now, the defect in a list simply of examples is, of course, that just given a list, you don't really necessarily know what the thing actually means. I'll use a stupid example to illustrate it. Suppose I were to say Jefferson, Franklin, and Jackson. What is that defining? Could be people who are involved in the government. You know, could be dead guys. Could be guys. Could be white guys. Could be famous guys. Could be guys on money. Could be the name of streets. Could be the names of people. Could be all kinds of things. So simply giving a list of examples, even though, again, there are legitimate uses for that, can be kind of a weak point in a definition. Now, how else can definitions go bad? Well, some of the most common flaws are these. One way to look at a definition is as a, well, I'll use two crappy analogies. One is like the firewall or password on your computer or phone, you know, or laptop. The idea is to keep people from getting into it. Another example is like the bouncer or an exclusive club. Now, the goal of both the bouncer and, say, the firewall on your computer is basically two things. One is to keep out what doesn't belong there, what's not supposed to be there. The other thing, of course, is to let in what is supposed to be allowed in. So if you got a firewall on your computer, what you want to do is let in stuff you want, like your email and web pages, and keep out stuff you don't want, like malware and other nasty stuff. And similarly with like a bouncer at your club, you want them to keep out the people who aren't on the list and let in the people who are. And if your firewall or bouncer is not doing their job correctly, they're letting in things that don't belong and keeping out stuff that does. And definitions are supposed to work the same way. They're supposed to let in the things that belong, keep out the stuff that doesn't. Now, one way a definition can go bad is being what's called too broad. And that's a definition that's too permissive. It lets in too much. And the reason that makes a definition bad is because it includes under the term things that shouldn't be there. For example, suppose we were for some reason struggling with defining the term art. And we defined it as something that creates an emotional response in people. Well, they could be true, but are there things that create emotional responses that wouldn't be art? For example, suppose someone gave you a big stack of Benjamin Franklin's, the money, not the guy. Would that create an emotional response if someone gave you $1 million? Yeah, probably like, yay, cool. But it wouldn't say that is art. Similarly, if someone rear-ends your car, you'd probably get an emotional response, but if the person hopped out and said, no, I'm a performance artist, I have rendered my art upon the back of your car, no. I mean, we'd respond to that emotionally, but we wouldn't say that was art. Now, definition can also be too narrow, where it keeps out stuff that should be allowed in. So, for example, again, suppose we're trying to define art, and we define art as visual representations designed to convey emotions. Now, that'd be too narrow, because are there forms of art that aren't visual? Yeah, music, you know, something you hear, it's not a visual art. And, you know, writing in a way is kind of visual, but obviously you could just, you know, you could record, you know, with like an audio book. And so that'd be too narrow. It'd leave out things that should be allowed in, like, you know, music, etc. Now, interestingly, you can have stuff that's too narrow and too broad. Like, for example, if I say, you know, something visual that is aimed at invoking emotions, well, someone could, you know, give someone the single finger salute, which is visual and also designed to invoke emotions, but would not say that that was art. So that'd be too narrow, keeping out too much, and too broad, letting in too much. And so what Socrates would do, typically with, you know, definitions, is show how things go wrong with them. Now, in terms of use, like today, like in your career and life, this would be something that you deal with if you're involved in a career that involves definitions. Again, law, business, etc., or doing contracts, would involve looking at definitions. And so those are the questions that you'd consider. Is my definition, you know, too narrow? Am I leaving out things that should be allowed in? Or is it too broad? If I use this definition, would that allow people to bring lawsuits against my company because my definition is too broad? Is it just a bad definition because it's circular or otherwise defective? And so it's useful even up. Okay, so quick recap. One key part of the Socratic method is argumentation by finding flaws in definitions. And flaws can include being too narrow, too broad, being both too narrow and too broad, being circular, taking the part as a whole, and just giving a list of examples. Before pressing on, anything about definitions that needs more defining stuff? Now, something we saw before that Socrates views as a method is the classic reductio ad absurdum. Translated from the cool Latin to less cool English, would be reducing to absurdity. Now, as I mentioned before, there's kind of two ways to do this. We'll just look at this one way. Now, suppose your objective is you want to prove something's not true, show that it's false. With the reductio, you assume what you're trying to disprove is true. Then you derive from that assumption something that is, we'll call it Q, and you show that it is absurd or a contradiction. Therefore, you conclude, because assuming this leads to something absurd or contradictory or impossible, so that assumption's got to be wrong. For example, and this is something, again, just because Socrates used it and he's really dead, doesn't mean it's not useful anymore. In fact, it's still very useful. It's still, a common technique. For example, centuries ago when I was in grad school, we were having a discussion about oppression, trying to define it. And someone suggested, in a way, kind of an obvious definition. Oppression is the mistreatment of a minority by a majority. It has a certain appeal to it, because you usually think of oppression as involving majorities oppressing minorities, and it involves oppression. But there's kind of a key flaw in the argument, or the definition, sorry. How so? Well, let us assume that the definition is true, that oppression is the mistreatment of a numerical minority by a numerical majority. Now, what percentage of the population is composed of women? Yeah. About 51%. So women are technically a majority. There's actually, interesting bit of trivia. More males are born, but less make it to like adulthood. If you've ever seen the movies like Jackass 1, 2, and 3, Jackass 3D, you know why. It often involves shopping carts and rockets and roofs. That's what we do. We're guys. We're natural selection involving shopping carts and rockets. Just can't help it. It's genetic. So women are a majority, which means that by that definition, women can never be mistreated or oppressed. But does that seem true? Have women always been treated great? No, we'd probably say women have been oppressed, and in some cases still are, even though they're a numerical majority. So the defect in the definition is the part about it being, a majority mistreating a minority. So the key part of oppression doesn't seem to be with the numbers, but with the treatment. So that'd be a reductio ad absurdum. Again, kind of a clever method. You assume someone's right to prove they're wrong. You can also kind of reverse the polarity. You can assume something is false, and then show that assuming it's false would lead to absurdity, and show that it's true. So, still pretty useful. Now, continuing along with his reasonings and definitions, or the method of counterexample. So. He also, according to Aristotle, introduced a form of inductive reasoning. Now, this is again something we still use today. According to Aristotle, Socrates is credited with introducing the inductive generalization. That's where you go from some particular examples and then generalize to the whole population. It is still something very useful today. I mean, to use, not a type of example that Socrates would use, but a modern one would be going back to the stuff about the elections, etc. When people want to know what percentage of people are going to support, say, Ted Cruz, or Mike Huckabee, or Rick Santorum, or Hillary Clinton. And we use a generalization. We go from our sample with people we poll to the whole voting population. And so this can be credited in part to our good dead friend Socrates. Another thing he did was developing universal definitions. Now, later, our good dead friend Plato, speaking through the character of Socrates, developed this even more. The idea that there are natural categories of things. And one thing of interest in philosophy and science is kind of that core question. We'll see when we get to part 3, talking about metaphysics, is the question of, are there actually natural categories of things? Are there natural kinds? And kind of the debate is between, do we just impose categories on things, social constructs, or are there real divisions? Now some of this again is kind of like, theoretical and scientific. To use one very concrete example, if you had biology, you probably had to learn, kingdom, phylum, subphylum, species, etc. And so one practical scientific question is, what do all cats have in common to make them cats? Is there really like a category of cats? Now this also becomes interesting when we get into issues of social matters and ethics. For example, one thing that has been the matter of considerable attention is whether or not there are natural categories of what we call race. Is that something that's socially constructed, or are there real categories? And some people, we often call them racists, believe that there are real categories, distinct, sub-races of human. Other people, like scientists, say you just get, one species, Homo sapiens. Another example would be gender categories. There are those who claim, there's 2 natural categories, male, female. And there are those who claim that gender categories, unlike physical sex, are social constructs, which is, today a matter of considerable contention. And so Socrates, was among the people laying down that groundwork. Are there really natural categories of things? And if so, which ones are like natural, and which ones are just kind of made up? Which is all kinds of interesting and boring implications. Now, a little more background for Socrates. Now, one important interesting question that we all get an answer to is, what happens when you die? Because we all get to die. Well, maybe not, because they're planning on having immortality in the flesh, so maybe if they keep advancing that technology, we may never die. But currently we can kind of expect, death. And as you might imagine, since there have been people have wondered, you know, what happens? Is it just, you know, you're dead, you're done? Are you reborn? Do you go to heaven, hell, afterlife, or what? Now the Greeks, like all people, had varying accounts of the soul, or to use the Greek term, psyche. And some of them involve the idea that the psyche or life is like a wind or fire. And there was a view that when you die, it's just like a fire going out, that you're done. Now Socrates was among the earliest philosophers to consider seriously the notion of a soul, a presumably non-physical entity that could survive the death of the body. Now we don't know for sure what his view was, because again we don't know what the real Socrates' views were, but it's the beginning of, you know, an interesting consideration about the notion of the soul, immortality, in the context of philosophy. And since we all get to die, we all have kind of a stake in finding out the answer to that. Last background for Soc. Now, the one thing that the experts on Soc think are probably true is his contributions to ethical theory. Now again, we can't be completely sure because we just have Plato's writings covering Socrates, but he addressed an important moral question, which is this: why be good? Now usually the assumption seems to be here that evil is preferable to good, because the question is not why be evil, the question is why should we be good? Now this is addressed in considerable detail in the book The Republic by Plato, and the key part is what's called the Ring of Gyges. And if you ever saw the Lord of the Rings, the idea will be fairly familiar. In the tale, what we're asked to imagine is this: there's someone who's got a magical ring that can turn them invisible. And this is a commonly asked question, like on internet surveys. If you had a magical ring that could turn you invisible, what would you do? And the character of Glaucon, who was actually Plato's brother, argued that if you had two magical rings of invisibility, and you gave one to someone who is unjust, a bad person, you know what they're going to do. They're going to put on the ring and do terrible stuff. But the question was, if you have a person who claims to be just and good, and you give them the ring, what would they do? And of course Glaucon says they would most likely, not guaranteed, but most likely put on the ring and do bad stuff, because there's more appeal in being unjust than just. And he challenged Socrates to answer the question, why should a person be good when they could avoid being punished? Because the whole point of the ring is, when you get the ring of invisibility, you can get away with stuff. And you can do whatever you want and not worry about getting caught. Because the usual practical answer as to why be good is, because if you're bad, people will do bad stuff to you. So avoid doing bad to avoid being punished. Now Socrates had an interesting view about how morality worked. It's called ethical introductionism. It's the view that, put kind of concisely and compactly, it's the view that goodness is not just a matter of behaving good, so to speak, but it's a matter of knowledge. And his view is that if you know the good, if you have wisdom, you would be good. So why are people bad? Well, his answer is this. He claimed famously that people are evil out of ignorance. Bless you. Now, it's not a matter of not knowing facts. For example, if you were to ask, someone, does stabbing people hurt them? Well, people would say, yeah. So it's not that evil people don't know that stabbing people hurts people. What they don't know, according to Socrates, is true wisdom. And his claim is that if people truly had wisdom, they would not be evil. Because his claim is the cause of evil is ignorance. Now, in his own day, and shortly thereafter, people were pretty critical. One playwright said that people are evil not because they're ignorant, because, roughly put, being evil is easier. Aristotle, in a polite bit of criticism, said this plainly contradicted the known facts, which is a polite way of saying that's really, really wrong. Now, but it is an important question as to why are people evil? Because in general, Well, generally do we want people to be, like, not evil? If you had to pick, like, your neighbors, would you, suppose you were, like, neighbor picking, would you go for, like, evil neighbors or non-evil? Yeah, non-evil. You know, from a practical standpoint, because, you know, evil neighbors will do, like, awful stuff. They'll, like, dump their leaves in your yard, burn down your house, you know, steal your newspaper, you know, do horrible things. Whereas good neighbors will help you out. So we all have very good reason to want people to be good. So knowing why people are bad is a pretty important question. So we can fix that. Now, given Socrates' view, the way to make people non-bad would be philosophy. The people who achieve wisdom, they'd stop being bad. Now, one practical example of this would be things like, well, use a couple quick examples. One would be when people are in church or synagogue or mosque, people give speeches, sermons, about how people should behave, to stay away from the devil's work, you know, do righteous deeds. And then, of course, we get public service announcements that say things like, this is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. This is your brain on drugs with some bacon and some hash browns. Deliciousness. And so we try to educate people by, you know, teaching them stuff. Well, if people only knew that, you know, drugs were bad, they'd stop. Now, of course, there's a good question of, does that actually work? Our good friend Aristotle said no. His solution, he thought Socrates was wrong. His solution is pretty straightforward. He believed that bad people must be ruled by pain. And the way to make them good is make them suffer for being bad, which is kind of how our society, you know, pretty much all societies work. So, getting back to the question of why be good, his answer was this. And this is what most philosophers tend to say. People like Confucius, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato. If you are good, they say, you'll be happy. Not all the time, not 24/7, but being good makes one happy. And being evil, according to Socrates, makes a person miserable. Even if the person has financial success, doing very well otherwise. Because he claims that the evil in a person's soul will destroy them, will drive them into essentially madness and despair. Or so he claims. Other people say, that's not true. Evil's awesome. So he believed again that, quick recap, why be good? Being good will make you happy. What is good? Well, having proper philosophical wisdom. Why are people bad? They lack wisdom. How do you make people good? You teach them stuff. Now into the home stretch on his background. Now, when you get to the Apology in just a bit, we'll see that Socrates is on trial. He's been accused of all these various crimes. And of course the good question is, so why is he really there? And why does he just, he's not even like he's not even like in jail. He literally walks from his house, you know, to the trial, and he could have skedaddled at any time. So the good question would be, if someone knew that they had a chance of like being put to death going to a trial, and they're just, you know, free to roam around, a good question might be, why would they stay? Well, in terms of why he got into trouble, the explicit reason, as we'll see, is for corrupting the youth. But many people, well, some people believe that it's because of his view of democracy at this time, or at least in part. At this time, the city of Athens was democratic, which meant the male property owners could vote on stuff. Now, Socrates gave a famous or infamous argument against democracy, and here's how it goes. Suppose, it's one we've seen before. Suppose you have a terrible, terrible pain in your side. Do you call on the people around you to vote about what to do? Do you like toss down a knife and say, let us vote to see what gets cut out? No, because, you know, as they say, you know, none of us are as dumb as all of us. And so that would probably lead to something, even if we had good intentions, we're not a doctor, wouldn't go too well. And so his view is that democracy is like trying to solve problems the same way. You just put it to a vote. Why think that if people don't know other stuff, you wouldn't vote on an operation, you wouldn't vote on like getting your car, you know, repaired. Why do the same thing for politics? You'd want someone who knows what they're doing to be in charge. Now, of course, it does raise a good question about justifying democracy. And the usual argument, not given by Socrates, but by others, is not that democracy is like the most effective, but that it involves, since if we regard ourselves all as like individuals with rights, that we have a say in it, not because we're going to get the best answers, but because it's our choice. We're free citizens. This goes back to our good dead friend John Locke and others. So he's critical of democracy, which got him into trouble. Now, if he was so critical of democracy, why did he just sort of, he wasn't, shackled in a cell and dragged before the court. He just kind of walked there. He could have just, kept on walking, walked on to, Thebes or Sparta or someplace. Now, he does answer the question explicitly. In the dialogue after the apology, he's been sentenced to death and he's waiting to die. And his friends come to bust him out. And they bribe the guard and they're going to slip him away, take him off someplace. And Socrates, being Socrates, argues why he should stay. And his reasoning is this. He puts forth what we call today social contract theory. The idea is that we have an agreement with each other and that forms the basis of government. And he argues that he had an agreement with the state. He was raised in the city of Athens. He could have left any time he wanted to, but by remaining, he agreed to obey the laws. And so he's morally obligated, even if he disagrees with the government, to remain. Because it's like, it's kind of like parents' rule. Live under, agree to live under their roof, follow their rules. He also believed it just wasn't purely social contract. He also believed what we now call natural law theory, that there is a foundation to laws beyond just people making stuff up. Now, leaping ahead centuries to the United States, at least, on paper, is based on this. As people like to point out, we get our rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, not from the government. It doesn't say we got together to make up some rights. What it says is we're endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, that we have these rights not from government, not from the state, not by rules written on paper, but as a matter of the nature of reality. It's a metaphysical reality. And so this is still important today, which is still a good question. We claim we have rights. Where do they come from? So, why is Soc still famous? Well, his contributions include this. First, Plato. Socrates, inspired and motivated Plato and led to the development we now consider Western philosophy. He's also believed by the experts to have developed ethical theory, which has influenced people to this day, and his personality as a character in the dialogues. Many people get interested in philosophy, starting with reading about Socrates and seeing how, interesting he is. Okay, so our last bit of background, Plato. As I mentioned, Plato was very strongly influenced by the death of Socrates. And he raised the question, what kind of society do we need to have that does not murder good people? Because he regarded, Socrates, as we'll see in the Apology, he's sentenced to death and he's executed by the state. And this profoundly affected Plato. And he wanted to build the ideal state in which good people were not murdered. And to this end, he wrote a work called The Republic, which lays out what he regards as a state that could probably never be, because it's supposed to be like the ideal state. But he tries to lay out a system of justice in which good people are not killed. He was born either 428 or 427 BC, died either 348 or 347 BC, and is of course still dead today. Now in his own time, like many great thinkers, he had trouble implementing his views. Many philosophers try to go and get their program, put into place. For example, I can take a good example would be Henry David Thoreau. He developed civil disobedience, tried to get it going, but of course it didn't work during his time. But it was later developed by Gandhi and Dr. King, and very successful later. We also have our good dead friend Confucius, who in his own time had a fair number of followers, but wasn't particularly successful in implementing his plan. Although long after his death, China adopted Confucianism as the official philosophy. Now, Plato had a similar problem. He had a chance to educate a ruler known as Dionysius the Younger, and it didn't go well. And he ended up having to flee Syracuse, to avoid being killed. And as a general rule, students trying to kill you is probably the worst teaching evaluation you can get, in general. Worse than even a 1 on Read by Professor, or no chili pepper. This could be the cruelest of all. Now, so what was he famous for in addition to, like, knowing Socrates and dying? Well, probably his main contributions were the following things. First, he developed what's known as Plato's Academy, from which you get our term. Have you ever wondered, like, why do we call it academics? Well, thanks to Plato's Academy. They may still wonder, so why academy? Why that word? Well, here's why. Plato built his school by a grove that was dedicated to the hero Academus, for real. And so if it had been built near a grove sacred to the hero Bob, would be studying at, the Bobatomy and doing Bobademics, or salad. It could be salademics, don't want to be sexist. So it just turned out. He's having to build it there, that's why it's called academics. We also, Aristotle is one of his students, built his own school called the Lyceum near a place dedicated to basically one version of Apollo, and we still have our term Lyceum today. And so the answer is it goes back to where they have to build their schools. The second thing that Plato did was writing the Platonic dialogues, and there's a bunch of them. I've got a book that I think it's supposed to be all the collected dialogues. It's this thick, with the paper that's so thin you can kind of see through it, in little tiny font that I can no longer read. It's super tiny. So he wrote a lot of stuff. And as far as we know, we think we only have about half of his stuff. We have his popular dialogues, but it's believed his more technical writing was lost. Now, he developed, another reason for his claim to fame is not just volume, but also he tried to develop a comprehensive system of philosophy. He worked on all the areas, metaphysics, logic, epistemology, ethics, and he was trying to build a complete system. And he believed that the hardest question in philosophy is about ethics. They have to deal with all the other stuff first. And then he died, and is still dead today, but he's still talked about, which gives him a kind of immortality. Okay, so that's our background. Before we go into our first reading, the Apology of Socrates, as written by Plato, anything about the stuff so far that needs more stuff? Okay. So to the Apology. Now, if you read it, you notice that Socrates never really apologizes. Because today we think of an apology as someone saying, I'm sorry. Usually a politician, something horrible they've done, perhaps involving a prostitute. Now, it's true. Number one apology from politicians involved. It's just statistics. So, we think of apology as someone saying, I'm sorry. But it comes from the older term apologia, which is not, I'm sorry, but a defense or argument. And so we've taken an apology now to mean, I'm sorry, but the old meaning was a defense. So it's the better translation would be the defense of Socrates. Now, the way the system worked in Athens at this time was in some ways similar to the legal system we kind of have now. The idea being that it was trial by jury. And in this case, you would have the male citizens of Athens, and a person would go, if they were accused of a crime or misdeed, they would come before this group of men, and they would make their case and their defense. And the person accusing them, or people accusing them, would make their argument against them. And then they would have a vote as to guilt or innocence. Then there'd be a second phase of the trial, which was the sentencing phase, in which the person accusing the person would propose a penalty. And the accused, now found guilty, so I guess the guilty party would propose a counter punishment, and then be a vote on it. So it's similar, our system in some ways is similar to that. Namely, you've got a system, a jury system, in which you have voting on guilt or innocence. One difference is that, of course, there's also the sentencing phase, and a couple big differences are, first, no lawyers, which may be why it's called the golden age of civil reasoning, and secondly, there's no like judge. There was just, you know, essentially entirely trial by jury. Now, Socrates has been accused of a variety of crimes. And the people accusing him, the main accuser is a fellow named Miletus, who's representing the poets. There's also Antaeus and another fellow who are accusing Socrates of all these terrible things. But the main ringleader is Miletus. He does the talking. Now, the charges, in general, are pretty broad. And today, if you look through them, you wouldn't see them as something they would charge people with today. They're things like inquiring to the things above, you know, the heavens, below the earth, making the worse appear the better cause, and doing all kind of, taking money for teaching, and all kinds of stuff like that. So things that we typically wouldn't consider to be charges today. Now, Socrates brings out at the opening sort of why he thinks he's really on trial. And here's his reason. When Socrates was younger, when I told this story before, one of his friends went to the Oracle of Delphi and was told by the Oracle that Socrates is the wisest of men. So he comes running back and says, Soc, guess what? Soc's like, what? He says, dude, you are the wisest of men. The gods have spoken. And what Socrates does is he decides that the gods are wrong. So he's on a mission from the gods to prove them wrong. And of course, if someone says you're the wisest, and you think that that's wrong, what do? You find somebody wiser. And so he sets out on that mission, trying to find someone wiser. Now, this comes up later, but Socrates also heard voices. For real. He actually, explicitly mentions this. He says he has a little voice or oracle or spirit guide that tells him when he's doing things that are a bad choice. And if you've read the Apology, he notes about how his little voice didn't tell him to not do stuff. And so that's why he kept doing it, because he saw that as a god. There was a New York Times bestseller book, well, not like super recently, but within a few years, about that subject, about people who hear voices in their heads. And Socrates is a prime example. Now, normally I think of people who hear voices in their head as being like, crazy. The voice tells them things like, it is time to cleanse the town, or, watch Adam Sandler films, horrible things like that no sane person would do. But interestingly, boringly enough, there are people who hear voices telling them to do smart things and good things. And we usually don't hear about those people because, well, if they're smart people, they don't mention the voice. But also, that doesn't really stand out, a voice giving good advice. And Socrates seemed to have that kind of voice in his head. They gave him good advice, except maybe leading to his death, but he thinks that that was good as well. Cheers for Socrates. Now, so there he is, the wisest of men, trying to find someone wiser, to disprove the gods. So he looks at the various groups. He goes to the politicians, because if you ask any politician, they have all the answers. And they are wise and good and awesome in all respects. But he found that the politicians didn't seem to know anything. And the politicians most esteemed seemed to be the worst of the bunch. And of course, they weren't too happy with this, because he'd basically do this in public. Back then they didn't have TV, so he'd be, talking to people like in the public square, and then word would get around. And so they would see, cross-examining politicians and making fools of them. Or rather, exposing their foolishness because they were already fools. He also spoke with the poets, because the Greek poets of this time, as I mentioned, supposedly were teachers of all things, who knew all this great stuff. And this is a subject of, well, his attacks on the poets take place in a dialogue called the Ion, which is named after the character Ion, and also in the Republic, Book 10. He goes after poetry pretty harshly with it. Now he finds that although the poets can speak many fine things, what he claims is the poets are out of their heads when they're talking. Everyone's heard of like the muses, divine inspiration, and he argued in the Ion that poets are basically crazy. It's the gods speaking through them, so they don't know what they're doing. And so he finds that the poets know nothing. Then he goes to the artisans, the craft people, and he finds that although they know many fine things, like how to make shoes or build chariots or construct ships, he says they seem to think they know all kinds of stuff. And he asks himself, would he rather be Socrates, who knows he knows nothing, or be them, thinking that they know all kinds of stuff they don't? And he says he's better off than them. So his ultimate conclusion is that true wisdom lies in knowing you know nothing. Now, on the face of it, if that were right, that would seem like education would be pretty easy. Day one, what do you know? Nothing. Diploma, flip the tassel over, go out and get a job, work, then die. But of course, we seem, as one of my professors said, for someone who said he knew nothing, he certainly seemed to know a whole lot of nothing. So what could he mean? Well, probably the most common interpretation is, well, there's a couple of interpretations. One is that if you know something, the tiny amount you know is just infinitely exceeded by what we don't know. That in effect, our wisdom is nothing. Our knowledge is nothing. And that when wisdom is that, not just like being able to say the words, I know very little, but truly understanding that, understanding the limits of one's knowledge. Another common option is the idea that a person knows they know nothing. Wisdom lies in knowing that, because only when you know you don't know everything can a person learn. And one common metaphor that martial arts masters like is the empty glass. If you go, like one of my teachers said, if you go into class with your glass full, you cannot learn anything, because the glass cannot be, nothing can be put in the glass. But if you go in with an empty glass, metaphorically speaking, or empty mind, then you can learn. You're not pushing away or blocking the knowledge. So the key to wisdom is not just saying I don't know anything, but that realization, being able to accept that you know nothing. He seems to be right. I remember when I was 18, I thought I knew every damn thing in the world, had every answer. In class, my hand was always up. The answer is this, the answer is that. Then as I got older, I learned, I don't know a damn thing. And now I know totally nothing. So that's the path of wisdom. And the path away from arrogance. That was pretty annoying. You probably would have not have liked, actually no, that was pretty awesome when I was 18. Annoyingly awesome. Or awesomely annoying. One of them. But that could be the case. So kind of interesting approach. Wisdom is knowing one knows nothing. Now we begin the stuff for the paper. So I'll switch the PowerPoints, swap them out for the paper stuff. So this is some of the important stuff. Well, it's all important. Okay, so for the paper, the reason I'm jumping in the middle of the apology is because the paper covers a small section of the apology, not the whole thing, just one particular part of it. So here is the complete guide, step by step, to doing the paper. Now the reading for it is the apology, which we're covering now, not the whole thing, but just a particular part of it, which we'll cover in just a few moments. The thesis of the paper is this, and you can just copy this, copy paste and put it into your paper. It's not plagiarism at all. The purpose of this paper is to summarize and critically evaluate Socrates' horse trainer analogy and unintentional argument. Now, since it's an argumentative paper, there's got to be an issue. And in philosophy, an issue is not like a psychological issue. It's not like someone who likes to dress up like a possum and run around doing whatever it is the possums do. I guess getting hit by cars, I think that's what they do. Or is that armadillos? They do that too. The issue is, in philosophy, it's a point of dispute, disagreement with two or more possible sides. So the main issue is this. Do those arguments refute the corruption charge against him. So Socrates is accused of corrupting the youth. Now, as we'll see, he modifies the charges. So it ends up actually being 3 different charges. One is he just corrupts the youth, no qualifiers. The second one is that he corrupted the youth, that he's the sole corrupter, the only one doing it. And the second modification is he intentionally corrupted the youth. Now the paper is written in a 4-part style: introduction, summary, argument, conclusion. And the reason why basically is for organization. One very, very critical skill in life, not just philosophy, is organization. Now, of course, some people think organization is bad because, crushes your free spirit and ends randomness, etc. And there are times when randomness is great. But there are other times that organization is really useful. Because being organized is probably one of the most important skills for success in life. You probably heard this before, but being able to order things, like you're managing your time, as they say, managing your life, managing the files on your computer, makes life so much easier. And one easy way to test this is, if you ever look at someone's, computer, just throws all the files just on the computer, and you ask them to find something, they're like, I have no idea. Versus people who carefully organize it. Now, also for writing paper, organization is good for a couple reasons. One, makes it easier on the person reading it because they know what you're trying to do, hopefully. Also for grading, that way I know what parts I'm grading. But it also helps you stay focused, so you know what you need to do in each of those sections. So the parts are introduction, summary, argument, conclusion. We'll go over each of those in turn. Now, for the paper, be sure to label the sections. And the reason why is because each of the sections has its own points. And so when I'm grading the paper and assigning points, I need to know which part is which. And sometimes, to be honest, I can't tell. Sometimes I'll be writing and I'm I have no idea where the introduction ends. I have no idea where they're arguing. I have no idea at all what's going on. And that's always bad. And so to use a final crappy analogy, it's kind of like if you're organizing a building, or better yet, like a store. If you want customers to be able to find stuff and not hate your store, it really helps to have it organized and labeled. So that way when someone's going through it, they know where they are, they know where they're going, they know where the stuff is. Now, the introduction is...
Can you say what the second argument was? You said the first one is the wrongdoer who corrupts the youth.
Oh, the 2 arguments? First one is the horse trainer analogy. And argument 2 is what's called, or I call, the unintentional argument. And the charge against him is being, the charge against him is, for the charges is a corrupter. The generic one is he's a corrupter of the youth. First modification is that he's the only person corrupted. He's the sole, not like soul like spirit, but soul as in single corrupter. And the second version is that he is not just corrupting the youth, but doing so with intent. So corruption with intent. Lone corrupter and corruption with intent. Now the introduction is super straightforward. It's worth 5 points out of the 100.
I was just wondering, is the reading on Blackboard?
Yes. Yep. If you for the paper, if you go to the paper section, there'll be the PDF for the paper guide in there. It's called intro paper, and it's got totally self-contained. It's got the excerpt from the reading, the outline, and all the details for it. I also have PowerPoints on there, there's slides, and there's also a video, basically what I'm doing now. Okay, so the introduction, pretty straightforward. Worth 5 points out of the 100. So basically, you'd want to work accordingly with that. In terms of length, it should be 125 words or less. Basically, half a page. Double space, normal font size. And when I grade it, I just go through and look for the 5 points. And the points are a thesis, which you can just copy right out of the thing, just copy paste. It's the thing about, summarize, blah, blah, blah. Point 2 is a summary statement. Essentially you say, I will summarize the charges against Socrates and his reply to the two modified charges. Thirdly is your position statement, in which you state, basically there's the following, in terms of your position, the questions are, does the horse trainer analogy work as an argument? Secondly, and we'll go over, this is all, we'll go over this in detail in just a bit. Does the unintentional argument work as an argument? Does the horse trainer analogy refute the original charge? Does it refute the modified charge? And then does the unintentional argument refute the original charge? Does it refute the modified charge? Now that sounds like a lot, but it can be stated pretty quick. A person might say, for example, it is my contention the horse trainer analogy succeeds as an analogy. Although it fails to refute the original charge, it succeeds in refuting the modified charge. It is my contention the unintentional argument is logically strong. Although I believe it does not refute the original charge, I will show that it refutes the modified charge. Or whatever your position might be. You might say, I believe the horse trainer analogy fails and refutes none of the charges. I believe that unintentional argument fails and refutes none of the charges. Whatever your position might be. Fourthly is the argument statement. Would be where you state, you don't lay out your arguments, you just briefly state how you will argue. So you might say, I will assess the argument by the horse trainer analogy by the standards of an argument by analogy, and I will consider the unintentional argument by considering historical examples that show Socrates is wrong, or whatever you might be saying. Lastly, some minimal background. You might say something like, Socrates was, the teacher of Plato, lived in Athens, said a lot of stuff, died, still dead today. Now again, it's only worth 5 points. You can actually do this like in a couple of sentences. You could say, the purpose of this paper is to summarize and critically evaluate, Socrates' two arguments. In the summary, I will present the key details of the charges against him and his horse trainer in an unintentional argument. It is my position that both arguments succeed as arguments, but they both fail to prove the original charges, but they succeed at addressing the modified charge. I will assess the horse trainer analogy as an analogy, showing to be successful. I will consider historical examples supporting the unintentional argument, also shown to be successful. Socrates is the guy, said some stuff, he died, he's still dead today. Done. So the introduction, pretty brief. If you find yourself going on 4 or 5 pages, you get way too much intro. Now, moving away from the particular paper, introductions are generally good because basically you're telling your audience what you're going to tell them. There's a classic method called the tell me 3 times method, sometimes called the army method. You tell people what you're going to tell them, you tell them what you told them, and that way they remember. It's also good, you can also give an introduction. It's kind of like if you ever look at a book or a DVD, a little kind of sales blurb. And the idea is so the reader knows what's coming up in a way. Before going to the summary, anything about the intro that needs more intro stuff?
What do you mean by, I've seen in this example, it says the key premise of the UA will be shown to be false, thus undercutting. What do you mean by undercutting?
Undercutting is basically non-metaphorically, it's literally like cutting, like the supports out of a building, it makes it collapse. Metaphorically, basically, to undercut an argument, if you get an argument, you can think of the conclusion as kind of, to use an analogy, think of the conclusion as like there's the camera. The conclusion is like the camera, the tripod is like the premises. And if you were to cut out the tripod, the camera would fall. And so when you're undercutting an argument, when you slice out a premise, you basically kill the argument. Metaphorically speaking, of course. Now the summary is a big chunk of the grade. So it's 45 points, and the objective there is to summarize the text. Now, summary has the following qualities of goodness. First, want it to be clear. Secondly, the point of a summary, of course, is to be concise. You don't want to be longer than what you're summarizing, because then you might as well read the original. So the idea is to, in fewer words than the original, say what's going on. But kind of the challenge is to make sure this is done accurately. So summarizing is actually fairly challenging because you have to take what is said, say it with far fewer words, but still capture the essential points. What's also fairly critical to avoid the whole, plagiarism thing is putting it into your own words, which is, fairly challenging. Because there's, direct, copying, copy paste. There's paraphrasing, which is saying the same thing just slightly different. Then there's summarizing, which is saying it entirely in your own words. Which is actually, and this seems like the easiest part, all you gotta do is summarize, but doing a proper summary is actually pretty tough, because you've got to clearly understand what's going on, what are the key points, recognize those, get rid of the ones that are less key, squish it down, make sure it's accurate, and most importantly, make sure it's in your own words. So you have to say what they said, but in your own way, while still staying true to what they said. Now, outside of philosophy, in terms of how this is useful, well, here's basically the sales pitch. Everyone, of course, keeps telling us we're in the information age, and we get flooded with information all the time. If you Facebook, you get a news feed just pouring stuff in 24/7. If you got Twitter, you get stuff pouring into your Twitter account. If you watch the news, or just go on the web, information constantly going in. And when you get a job, when you're working, information constantly coming in. So you need to know, as they often say, what's fluff and what's not, what's wheat, what's chaff. And so summarizing skills, the critical part of that is recognizing what's important and what's not. And that's actually a very difficult skill, because anybody can sit there and just, have words pouring into their ears and, images into their eyes, but knowing what's actually important, very critical skill. Now, being able to condense it down to make it useful, also important. And one thing you'll typically do, in your profession, is you'll often have to convey information to other people. And so you'll want to be able to do so, concisely, accurately, and in your own words. So basically, dealing with the information age does require this critical skill, being able to summarize stuff, know what's important, know what the really important points are, being able to condense it down to a manageable form, and being able to convey it to others accurately, correctly, concisely, and clearly. And if you're good at that, that'll serve you well in whatever profession you're in. Unless you're in a profession where you never interact with people or information, which would be few professions. I guess if you're a hermit, you're a professional hermit, wouldn't need that. So, what is the stuff that goes into the summary? Well, before going to the stuff, anything so far that needs more stuff? Now, a really safe but boring way to do the paper is to take the detailed outline, and I've got, if you go to the paper guide or the notes, there's a very, very detailed outline. This one's a little, chopped back a little bit. But if you want to make sure that all the stuff you need is in the summary, have the outline there, and just kind of boringly go through and make sure all that's in the outline is in the summary. And that's tedious, boring, but safe. If you want to live a little more dangerously, then it would involve trying to judge what stuff here is important and what stuff is perhaps less so. What do I need to convey, that is critical and what is not so critical. So what stuff needs to be in there? Well, first thing is this. So what's going on? Well, Socrates has been charged with two main charges in this part of the apology. Charge one is that he is a doer of evil who corrupts the youth. Charge two is that he does not believe in the gods of the state, but as his own divinities. Now for the paper, this is very important, even though you'll mention this in the summary, the paper only focuses on this charge. I mean, he does address this in the apology, but the paper is pretty narrowly focused. The concern is just with charge one. So, what Socrates is going to do is this. After he presents the charges, he says he's going to essentially turn the tables on Miletus. He's going to show that it is not him, Socrates, who is bad, it is Meletus. He's going to try to prove that Meletus is a doer of evil, that Meletus is pretending to be earnest, pretending to care, but he doesn't really care about the youth, and he's going to try to expose Meletus's true motivation, which is not to protect the youth, but to bring men, specifically Socrates, to trial. So kind of his mission objective is to, again, turn the tables on Meletus and show Meletus is really the bad guy. Now what he does to sort of trap Meletus is engage in the Socratic method of questioning. And here's how it goes through. Meletus has claimed that he thinks a great deal about the youth because, he's gone to the trouble of seeking out the great corrupter Socrates to bring him to trial. So, Meletus asks, or rather Socrates asks Meletus to tell the judges who is it that is benefiting the youth. Because surely, if Meletus is so concerned about the youth, he would know these things. Now, he walks Meletus through a series of questions, but the ultimate result is this. He gets Meletus to claim in front of everybody that every Athenian, every citizen, except the sole corrupter Socrates, improves the youth. So what he's done here is he's gotten Meletus to change the charge. The original charge is that he, Socrates, is a corrupter of the youth. But through this questioning, he gets Meletus to modify it. And so the first modified charge, or modification of the charge, is not just he's a corrupter, but he is the only corrupter. And everyone else benefits the youth, and it's Socrates and Socrates alone that corrupts. So that's modification 1. Before heading to the next slide, anything about this that needs any stuff? Now at this point, he brings forth the first argument, the horse trainer analogy. Now he picks the horses because the citizens of Athens would be familiar with horses. To use a crappy analogy, it'd be like using, well, I used to say car analogy, but apparently cars are out. I guess today would be a smartphone analogy, because everyone's got a smartphone and everyone knows about their phone and loves their phone. So he uses the horse trainer analogy because people he's talking to would know horses. Now he says that one person is able to do the horses good, to take care of them, do them well. And this, of course, is a person who is the trainer of horses, because that's their thing, they're horse trainers. And other people would injure the horses. So what he's setting up basically is this. We got the horses. Badly drawn horses. And you've got the person who's a horse trainer, who knows horses, can benefit them, because she knows about horses. That's her deal. So what about other people? Well, other folks who don't know about horses, don't know what they eat, don't know how to train them, don't know stuff about them, even if they have good intentions, they would harm the horses. Perhaps not out of malice, but out of ignorance. If someone doesn't know what they eat, for example. And so his claim is, the setup for the first part of the analogy is that in the case of horses, the few, the trainer, knows horses and can improve them. The many, who are ignorant, if they try to, even if they go act from good intentions, will not be able to help the horses. Now, here's where he works out the analogy. He says, the same is true not just of horses, but all animals, including the youth. So here's the analogy part. So this is the first setup. You got the horses, the one trainer who benefits them, the many who are ignorant who harm them. And he says, by analogy, this is true of the youth. So with badly drawn pictures, we would have an analogous scenario. Here are the youth in the role of the horses. Here is the one in the role of the horse trainer. Here are the many in the role of the many. And his reasoning is that this is true, then this would also be true. So it's true of horses that the few who have knowledge benefit them, the many who are ignorant harm them. The same would hold true of the youth. By analogy, the few who have knowledge would benefit them, and the many who are ignorant would harm them. And he closes by saying, the youth, of course, would certainly be happy with only one corrupter and everyone else improving them. But, given his argument, he says Meletus is totally getting it wrong, that Meletus clearly didn't give the matter any thought. So, that's the analogy. This is a scenario for the horses. The one who knows benefits them, many who are ignorant harm them. By analogy, the youth are in the role of the horses. The one is in the role of the one who has knowledge who benefits them. The many are in the same role as the many who would harm the youth. So he concludes from this that he is not the sole corrupter. Essentially, Meletus is wrong. There would be rather many corruptors. So in the summary, what you're doing is just summarizing that. So the idea is basically to lay out the argument. You don't have to use cartoons though. No requirement there, especially bad ones like those. Before going to the next stuff, anything about this? Needs any more stuff? Now he then turns to argument 2, the unintentional argument. And once again he walks Meletus through a series of questions. And what it amounts to is this. Through a series of questions, he gets Meletus to agree to the following claims. First, it's better to live among good citizens than bad. Secondly, the good do their neighbors good, the evil do evil. And no one would rather be injured than benefited, and no one likes to be injured. All that seems pretty reasonable.
So Meletus agrees that Socrates' analysis about the horses are right?
Yeah, basically he kind of gives up. Because, I mean, one thing, to be fair, of course, we got to keep in mind that it's Plato writing it. So we don't actually have an official transcript from the trial, so we don't know for sure if it really went that way. But in the dialogue, Meletus, he doesn't want to accept that, but he doesn't, he just kind of, kind of accepts it, goes along. And then with the, the questioning in the unintentional argument, same thing. Basically, in a way, it's easy because all these things seem to be pretty clearly true. No one wants bad neighbors because they do, by definition, bad neighbors do bad stuff, and people don't want to be hurt. Now, Socrates then modifies the charge against him. He essentially asks Meletus, am I, Socrates, corrupting the youth intentionally or unintentionally? Is it corruption with intent or without? And Meletus says it's intentional, that Socrates knowingly and willingly corrupts the youth. So how does he counter Meletus? Well, he got Meletus to admit the good do good and evil do evil. And he gets Meletus to admit that people don't want to be harmed. And Socrates knows if he makes people around him bad, corrupts them, then it's likely that he himself will be hurt in turn. But Meletus has accepted that no one likes to be hurt. So Socrates concludes this. Given that if he corrupted people, they probably hurt him, no one wants to be hurt, either, he concludes, he doesn't corrupt them, because if he did, he'd be hurt, which he knows better than to do, or if he is corrupting them, he's doing so unintentionally. So maybe he is corrupting them, but he's not doing it with intent, because if he knows this, so he'd not intentionally put himself at risk. Either way, he says, Meletus is wrong, because Meletus' charge is corruption with intent. But if Socrates' argument works, either he's not a corrupter at all, so innocent. Or if he does corrupt, it's unintentional. So he's not an intentional corrupter. Now he takes another shot at Miletus here, saying that if his offense is unintentional, Miletus should have corrected him, should have taken him inside and said, Socrates, I know you're a decent guy, but all the stuff you're saying is really bad for the youth. And they're gonna become bad and hurt you. But he says Miletus never did that. Miletus brought him to a place of punishment rather than taking him aside and correcting him. So he concludes Miletus doesn't care about the youth. He's just out to get Socrates. So, a bad cartoon. Here's what's going on. The claim is that if Socrates made his neighbors bad, symbolized by little devil horns, that they would hurt him. But no one wants to be hurt, so either he didn't make them bad, or if he did so unintentionally, because he knows that if he makes them bad, they would hurt him. So either way, Miletus is wrong. Either he didn't corrupt them, in which case he's not a corrupter at all, or if he did corrupt them, it wasn't with intent, in which case he's not an intentional corrupter. And so he concludes, either way, Miletus is wrong.
I'm kind of confused. Are you saying that since Socrates didn't get, since according to Plato, Socrates didn't get hurt because if he was hurting, it would be because he was hurting people, or he was. Okay, so what you saying?
Oh, what he's saying basically, I'll use like a more concrete situation. Suppose I'm hanging around some people, and what Socrates is saying is, suppose I decide to make the people around me, I'm accused of making them into bad people, violent people. What Socrates is saying, well, if I take the people around me and I make them bad, then I know that when they become bad, they'll do bad stuff. And since I'm around them, they'll do bad stuff to me. But I know that, so I'm certainly not going to intentionally make them bad. So he says, either I didn't make them bad, because I know better than to do that, or if I did make them bad, I did so unintentionally because I would never intentionally cause harm to myself. So his claim is not, he's not saying the youth didn't hurt me so I didn't do it. His claim is, I know that if I made them bad intentionally, they would hurt me. And so either I didn't corrupt them because I know better, or if I did corrupt them, I did so unknowingly because I don't want to get hurt. To use another crappy analogy, suppose someone is accused of insulting someone, insulting someone very dangerous. And the person said, well, no, I wouldn't insult that person because I know that if I insult them, they're going to come and kill me. So either I didn't insult them, in which case I'm innocent, or if I insulted them, I did so totally unintentionally because I totally know they would come and kill me if I insulted them intentionally. And so the person would say, either I didn't insult them, or I unintentionally did so, because I'd never intentionally insult someone who's likely to try to kill me for that. Anything else? Okay, so that's the summary thing. The idea, again, is basically to clearly, concisely, and accurately in words, lay out those key points. Now, the argument section is also worth 45 points. And the beginning is pretty, this looks like a lot of stuff. But the first thing to do is actually pretty straightforward. You clearly state your position. And there are 6 issues, which seems like a way bunch. But as we'll see, you can actually just do this like in a couple sentences. The first question is, does the horse trader analogy work as an analogy? That's straightforward, yes or no. Secondly, does it refute the original charge, which is he's a corrupter? That's also straightforward, yes or no. Thirdly, does it refute the modified charge, which is he is the only corrupter? Now this, again, this seems like a lot, but you can do this in one sentence. You might say, it is my position the horse trader analogy works as an analogy. It fails to refute the original charge, but succeeds in refuting the modified charge. Or you might say, it is my position the horse trader analogy fails as an analogy, so it fails to refute both charges. Then the second set, the questions are, does the unintentional argument succeed as an argument, which is yes or no? Does it refute the original charge? Yes or no? Does it refute the modified charge? Yes or no? And again, this seems like a lot, but this is just one sentence. You could say, it is my position that unintentional argument succeeds as an argument, although failing to refute the original charge, it succeeds in refuting the modified charge. And so all this stuff comes down to basically two sentences. Now the top part, once you state your position, is backing it up. So how do we assess the argument by analogy? Well, we saw this before. The form is what we saw before, that in this case Socrates is saying the horses have certain qualities, the youth have certain qualities, the horses are harmed by the many, benefited by the few, therefore this is true of the youth. Or roughly put, the horses are harmed by the many, benefited by the few, the youth are like the horses, therefore they're benefited by the few and harmed by the many, therefore Miletus is wrong. So how do you assess it? Well, the way to do it in a very organized way is just saying, this is an argument by analogy, there are three standards. I will consider each of them in turn. First is the number of properties they have in common. So the question would be, do they have enough in common? If yes, why? If not, why not? Secondly, you'd say the second standard is the relevance of the shared qualities to the issue of corruption. And then you'd argue, yes, they do have enough relevant properties, so they're relevant enough, or not. Why or why not? And lastly, whether there's things that break the analogy, that make the youth not like horses, so the analogy falls apart. And that'd be like yes or no, why or why not. And so to organize it, you just go for each of them, and you can explicitly just copy the standards. Standard 1, standard 2, standard 3, and then just address it. Show how it does or does not. Now, if the argument succeeds in all three, you would conclude by saying, thus I have shown the argument succeeds. If you believed it fails at these, you would conclude by saying, thus I have shown the argument fails. Now, once you've assessed the argument, the last thing to do, we'll close with this and pick up for the remainder on Monday. The next part is to address, does it respond to the charge? Now the first charge is that he's a corrupter. And here's the easy answer. If the horse trader analogy succeeds, it shows that there are many corruptors and one or few benefactors. But even though Socrates probably is implying pretty clearly he's the horse trainer, he doesn't actually argue for that. He doesn't prove that. So it doesn't seem to refute the charge because he does not explicitly show that he, Socrates, is the horse trainer. So probably the easy answer is it doesn't really do that because it just shows there are many corruptors, but Socrates could still be among them. Now in regard to the modified charge, the answer here, again, is in one sentence. If you think the argument worked, you'd probably just say this. The argument, I've shown the argument succeeded as an analogy. The argument shows that what is true of the horses, the many corrupt, the few benefit, is true of the youth. Miletus's charge is that Socrates is the only corrupter. Given the success of the analogy, he refutes the charge. Now if you showed the argument failed, you would just say, I have shown the analogy fails as an argument. A failed argument cannot support a conclusion. Therefore, he did not refute the charge. Okay, so next time on Monday, we'll pick up the last bit of the paper, so wrap it up, and then finish up the rest of Socrates.